This is not how monetary systems collapse. A swap line gets established between central banks. A port facility in northern Canada begins accepting yuan-denominated letters of credit. Digital payment infrastructure gets tested in transactions that bypass SWIFT entirely. And beneath those ordinary financial arrangements, the architecture of dollar dominance begins to fracture without anyone announcing it has already broken. Most people think reserve currency status is permanent. They assume change will be visible, announced, negotiable. History does not work that way. What I am describing is documented establishment of financial infrastructure in Canadian territory, allowing major trading partners to settle transactions without touching dollar systems. The swap lines are formalized, the payment systems tested. The timeline for deployment, according to early indicators, falls within the window where American authorities still assume dollar centrality cannot be challenged by a traditional ally. That assumption is the misread. De-dollarization discussions focus on adversaries, China building alternatives, Russia trading oil and rubles. These are framed as desperate measures by isolated regimes posing no fundamental threat. What is happening in Canada is different. This is the G7 member with the longest undefended border with the United States, the closest military ally, quietly building infrastructure to conduct international commerce independent of dollar settlement. When hostile nations attempt de-dollarization, Washington frames it as isolation. When Canada does it, the framing stops working. This is not currency warfare. It is structural separation. The dollar has functioned as gravitational center of international finance for 80 years. Not from love of American management, but because there was no alternative with sufficient scale and liquidity. You traded in dollars or accepted dramatically higher costs and limited market access. That monopoly depended on two foundations: no other economy large enough to provide depth for reserve currency status, and America's allies having no reason to build alternatives. Both foundations are eroding simultaneously. The yuan economy now represents sufficient scale to anchor major trading relationships. China provides swap lines and payment infrastructure to countries seeking alternatives. The technical capability exists. What was missing was a Western democracy willing to legitimize those alternatives through participation. Canada, under Mark Carney's strategic direction according to unconfirmed reports, has provided that legitimization. The CNY-CAD swap arrangements allow Canadian exporters to settle transactions with Asian partners without converting through dollars. Early assessments suggest approximately $2.8 trillion in annual trade flows could shift to direct bilateral settlement over 5 years. That represents dollar-denominated transactions that would no longer occur. Every transaction settling directly in yuan or Canadian dollars is one where dollars are not needed, not demanded, not held in reserve by foreign central banks. This is where monetary sovereignty quietly changes hands. The dollar's reserve status rests on transaction necessity. Countries hold dollars not because they want exposure to U.S. assets, but because they need dollars to buy oil, to clear international transfers. Remove that necessity, and demand becomes optional. American policymakers understood this when they weaponized the dollar through sanctions and swift exclusions. What they failed to anticipate was that weaponization would motivate even friendly countries to build alternatives. You cannot threaten financial infrastructure access and expect perpetual dependence. Canada watched Russian reserves frozen, Chinese institutions threatened. Canada recognized any country whose policy choices displease Washington could face similar treatment regardless of alliance history. The lesson was clear. Dollar dependency is strategic vulnerability. Draft assessments suggest full operational capacity for non-dollar settlement could be achieved within 36 months. That coincides with the period when American authorities treat de-dollarization as theoretical rather than operational reality. By the time Washington recognizes the infrastructure exists, transactions will already flow through it. This is not a crisis. It is a reordering. A Canadian mining company sells potash to Chinese manufacturer, currently invoiced in dollars, settled through dollar banks, requiring both parties maintain dollar reserves. Under new infrastructure, invoiced in yuan, settled directly through CNY-CAD swap facilities, requiring $0 exposure. The transaction completes. No dollars change hands. It simply stops contributing to global dollar demand. Multiply across thousands of daily transactions, and the effect becomes structural. Canadian economy does not collapse. Chinese trade continues. But dollar volume needed for international commerce decreases steadily without dramatic announcement. American Treasury officials cannot sanction this. Canada is not breaking rules. Canadian institutions simply offer counterparties the option to settle in alternative currencies using legally established infrastructure. The United States cannot force dollar dependence when Canada has built working alternatives. Financial markets assume reserve currency shifts take generations. Sterling's decline took decades. The assumption is dollar displacement will follow similar timelines with ample warning. But that assumes transitions driven by economic decline rather than active infrastructure deployment. Britain lost reserve status because its economy shrank. America is losing dollar dominance because partners are choosing to route around dollar systems weaponized for geopolitical pressure. The speed is different. The visibility is different. Hudson Bay is being transformed into what Canadian planning documents describe as a post-dollar trade nexus. Ships are already docking. Grain terminals operational. Digital payment systems linking facilities to Asian networks are being tested in live environments. When Chinese cargo vessels load Canadian wheat at Churchill and settle through direct yuan-CAD conversion, those transactions represent permanent subtraction from global dollar velocity. The infrastructure exists to bypass dollar preference entirely. This is how systems change without announcement. The American position would be stronger if this were isolated, but parallel developments occur across allied economies. European central banks expand yuan swap facilities. Gulf states accept yuan for oil. ASEAN economies establish regional payment systems bypassing dollar clearing. Canada is not leading rebellion. Canada is joining migration already underway, but lacking Western democratic participation to provide legitimacy. American officials cannot argue de-dollarization is authoritarian when Canada, Germany, and Singapore build the same infrastructure China pioneered. The timeline compression makes this different from historical precedent. Sterling's decline unfolded over 40 years. Dollar displacement is compressed into years because infrastructure enabling alternatives is being deployed deliberately. When infrastructure is complete, when payment systems operational, transactions will shift quickly because barriers preventing shift will have been systematically eliminated. The 2.8 trillion figure represents theoretical maximum transaction volume that could move to non-dollar settlement. Early projections suggest even partial deployment could shift 800 billion to 1.2 trillion annually within 18 months. That represents approximately 15% of offshore dollar demand. Remove 15% and price stability becomes impossible. The second-order effects cascade through every dollar-denominated market. Treasury yields rise to attract buyers no longer forced to hold dollars for transactions. Federal deficit becomes more expensive to finance. Fiscal constraints that seem manageable become binding. None of this happens through crisis. It happens through gradual erosion appearing as statistical trend rather than dramatic event. By the time the trend is undeniable, infrastructure causing it will be too established to dismantle. Canada has not announced this strategy publicly because announcements would force American counter-responses. What Canada has done is construct infrastructure while describing it as monetary cooperation and trade facilitation. The language is chosen to avoid triggering political reactions, but the objective is clear in the architecture. Every swap line, every digital payment test, every port facility accepting non-dollar settlement is infrastructure designed to make dollar dependence optional. When dependence becomes optional, it stops being dependence. Mark Carney, if unconfirmed reports prove accurate, has approached this with methodical patience, demonstrated navigating financial crises as central banker. No dramatic announcements, no provocative statements, just steady construction of alternatives presented as routine modernization. The genius is creating no obvious inflection point where Washington can intervene, no single decision to reverse, just technical arrangements that individually appear reasonable but collectively represent post-dollar financial architecture. By the time American officials recognize what has been built, the question will not be whether Canada should have done this. The question will be whether other allies follow the model Canada demonstrated. If current trajectories hold, the answer is determined. Every finance ministry watching Canadian de-dollarization succeed will conduct similar assessments about their own dollar dependence. Every central bank will evaluate whether building alternatives is justified by strategic autonomy they provide. The migration will not require coordination. It will happen through parallel assessments reaching similar conclusions. This is not the end of the dollar as major currency. It is the end of the dollar as necessary currency. American markets will remain important, but the assumption that all international commerce must flow through dollar systems will have been proven false. Countries will hold dollars because they choose to, not because they must. That distinction transforms everything. Currency determines who captures value from economic output. The country controlling settlement systems extracts rent from every transaction, even when producing nothing. America has collected that rent for 80 years through dollar dominance. The rent is ending not because American power collapsed, but because the infrastructure forcing payment has been bypassed. By the time this becomes clear in policy documents, the transition will be substantially complete. The decisions being made today are not contingency planning. They are recognition that the dollar-centric system has already been superseded by alternatives built quietly while everyone assumed the old system was permanent. History does not reverse because it was misunderstood. By the time change becomes obvious, return to previous state is no longer possible. Canada did not plan to end dollar hegemony. Canada planned to reduce dollar dependence. But when the second largest economy in North America demonstrates dollar independence is achievable, every other economy will draw appropriate conclusions. The dollar's monopoly is ending not through collapse, but through quiet construction of alternatives. And the country building those alternatives is not an adversary, it is the ally that was taken for granted.